Welcome to the Explainer. So, have you ever looked at a tool or maybe a piece of furniture or even a plant and just thought, well, you're not exactly winning any beauty pageants, but man, you get the exact job done? Today, we're jumping right into a fascinating case study about exactly that kind of dilemma. We're examining a recent entry from Eng's Notes on Gardening Diary, where the ultimate choice between functional utility and aesthetic beauty really takes center stage. And as we all know, every single choice in a garden carries immense weight. Planning a garden bed is a series of highly strategic decisions. Let's look at what Eng cleverly calls the Floss Flower compromise. In an entry from June 3, 2026, Eng writes, "While the blooms aren't exactly up to my aesthetic taste, I've decided to explore the floss flower. I absolutely love this because it drops us right into the intimate thoughts of the gardener, right? Eng is completely looking past the surface-level look of the Ageratum, commonly known as the floss flower, and making a highly practical, calculated decision to look deeper at what the plant can actually offer." Okay, let's dive into this, because when we weigh the plant's traits directly, the contrast is super clear. On one side, you have the distinct drawback. Eng just doesn't really like the look of the blooms. Fair enough. But on the benefit side, the floss flower brings incredibly strong, sturdy stems and, crucially, functions as a tender perennial. These biological utilities completely outweighed the superficial dislike of the flowers themselves. The absolute crucial motivating factor here is that exact phrase, tender perennial. Because it lives for multiple years but remains highly sensitive to freezing temps, getting the environment right means this plant isn't just some one-season wonder. It becomes a recurring foundation for a long-term strategy. For Eng, understanding this specific biological trait is everything. And this brilliantly illustrates why that trait matters so much. It perfectly connects to Eng's overarching goal, lush foliage. Inspired by photos found online, Eng wants to propagate these floss flowers in massive quantities. By utilizing a plant that lives for multiple years, Eng is attempting to build a sustainable, expanding engine for all that dense, beautiful greenery they've been aiming for. But of course, every great plan eventually hits a snag. Here is the major roadblock Eng suddenly faces, perfectly setting up the central conflict of our explainer. How do you harvest tiny seeds? Think about it. When your entire grand vision relies on propagating massive quantities of a plant, you inevitably need seeds. Lots of them. But floss flower seeds are exceptionally small. I mean, they're literally microscopic, making the idea of manual collection an absolute nightmare. Consider the frustrating contrast here. We have the macro goal, massive, sprawling, lush foliage intended to cover the garden, pitted directly against the micro problem, microscopic, nearly impossible to harvest seeds. It's a massive scale colliding. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a massive ambition colliding head-on with a microscopic reality. You want a massive garden, but you're stopped dead in your tracks by microscopic seeds. It's a classic, agonizing bottleneck. Which brings us to natural solutions and microclimates. Now, the tension here is very real for any gardener trying to scale up their operation. But Eng's solution isn't some painstakingly tedious manual technique or a fancy new tool. Instead, it's a brilliant pivot in strategy. Rather than fighting nature, Eng decides to step back and let nature step in to do the heavy lifting. Now, what's really interesting about this is how elegantly simple the new approach is. It's a two-pronged strategy. First up, natural wind propagation. Yep, Eng is simply going to let the wind scatter those frustrating seeds all around the garden area. Second, assess different microclimates. By letting the wind randomly distribute the seeds, Eng completely bypasses the manual harvesting problem entirely and turns the entire garden into an active, living laboratory. Just to briefly clarify why this is so vital, a microclimate is simply a small, localized area with a climate slightly different from the surrounding area. Because the wind is scattering these sensitive plants into varying environmental pockets, some with more sun, some perfectly protected from a harsh breeze. Observing how they handle these distinct microclimates becomes the ultimate test for their long-term survival. The differing localized climates will reveal exactly where the floss flower naturally thrives. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this natural hands-off approach definitely requires some patience, playing out across a specific timeline. Right now, it's just about the initial planting and letting the wind distribute the seeds. In the coming weeks, the critical observation phase begins, watching where those seeds actually land and manage to sprout. And finally, in the coming months, Eng will see the definitive results of this grand experiment to achieve that lush foliage. Which leaves us with this provocative final thought.
Aang transformed a frustrating bottleneck into a brilliant, effortless experiment by simply stepping back and changing the strategy. So, what complex challenges in your own life or work could benefit from a hands off, natural approach? Sometimes the absolute best way to solve a microscopic problem isn't to force a manual solution, but to just let the environment naturally sort it out for you. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope you take a little bit of that gardener's problem solving mindset into whatever you're cultivating next.